Tonight's class is entitled The Homeless Industrial Complex Causes and Cures. And Paul Glumaz has been a close student, and not just a student, but a very active practitioner in fighting the takeover of our great West Coast cities by drugs, crime, and homelessness. Tonight, he's going to tell under the heading of, as I said, the Homeless Industrial Complex Causes and Cures. He's going to talk to us about what brought this about, how it's happened, how it can be reversed. So with that, let me pass it over to Paul.
Good evening. Hi. So I'm going to be reading from a draft that I've been writing, interspersed with commentary. And so it might seem a little strange, but I'm going to be doing it that way. So I'll start off by reading 2 paragraphs from the commentary. From the draft, and then I'll do some commentary, and then I'll read some more. Okay, so in 2021, when I ran for Seattle City Council, and later in 2022, when I ran for Congress in Seattle's 7th Congressional District, it became obvious to me that Seattle had become, and still is, one of our nation's leading meccas for the drug-addicted homeless, a compassionate, welcoming place with free needles, food, free tents, a possible low-barrier shelter, maybe some affordable housing, along with virtually no criminal enforcement for the crimes addicts have to commit to have the means to procure their drugs as they destroy local businesses and neighborhoods. What amazed me then, and still amazes me, is the intense institutional opposition and hostility toward enforcing the laws on drug possession and trafficking as part of protecting the community and providing a pathway out of hell for those who are addicted. How is it that the voters and residents of Seattle find this and the witnessing of human beings being destroyed on the streets acceptable? They don't. Rather, the voters have not yet been organized to defeat those who protect and profit from this dystopian situation. So that's the question that was posed. And so I want to situate this not as something that's happening now, but something that is in a historical economic context. And briefly, you had the 1971 change in the global banking system, financial system, where you had the dominance of capital flight, not development. 2, you had the rise through this of the post-industrial service economy as opposed to a growing industrial economy. And 3, with this, there was a transformation of cities and political formations emerging not based on labor, industry, or agriculture. So you have a new kind of political formation emerging in the cities, which are connected to the post-industrial society. So having said that context, giving you the historical context, so let's go to the Seattle story on the rise of the Frank Chop machine. There was a guy who built this political machine, and ultimately the homeless industrial complex. So now I'm going to read some more of the of the draft. So this story begins in the 1980s with a radical community organizer by the name of Frank Chop And over several decades, Frank Chop built a political machine based on delivering social justice to the poor and marginalized elements of society in the form of services, everything from food, shelters for the homeless, eventually affordable housing, and much more. You could call it charity with a class conflict political edge. Over those decades, there emerged a community of activists, social justice warriors, intertwined with a grant writing industry, embedded in a growing number of nonprofits that oversaw much of the administration of these services without the strictest of auditing and oversight. Gradually, all of this congealed into an organized political force that began to influence electoral outcomes. As the leader and organizer of the organizers of this process, Frank Chop was elected to the Washington State Legislature in 1994. By 1999, he was co-speaker of the State House. And by 2002, Chop was the Speaker of the Washington State House till 2019, when he left office. With the emergence of this extensive social services political machine, Frank Chop was able to broker political power to become the most powerful political figure in Washington State history. This machine dominates Washington State politics today. So going back to 1983, Frank Chop formed the Fremont Public Association, now known as Solid Ground. It promoted services as emergency food bank, a clothing bank, and an emergency employment program. And thereafter, Frank Chop was involved in all kinds of agency services programs, such as King County Housing Opportunity Fund, Cascade Shelter Project, the Food Resource Network, the Workers Center, Lettuce Line, Community Voicemail, the Sandpoint Community Housing Association, Port Jobs, the Committee for Economic Opportunity, and the Low Income Housing Institute. A lot more than that. And he organized all of this. A good example of Frank Chop's method of expansion of services and political influence is that in 1983, following the founding of Fremont Public Association, Chop put together a coalition of 50 agencies, which was called Coalition for Survival Services, beginning with an initial grant of $500,000 from the city of Seattle. This coalition has grown over the 40 years to the level of receiving today over $100 million annually. One of the legendary talents of Frank Chop and his wife Nancy Long was the ability to write impressive grants and organize others to set up nonprofits. As the services and social justice for the marginalized grew, there was, at around the same time in the middle of the 1990s, going into the 2000s, a whole reinventing government movement, which advocated farming government services to nonprofits. In this climate, Frank Chop was instrumental in advancing legislation favorable to the formation of nonprofits, especially in the social services sector. The major problem of the growth of these nonprofits is that for such a social service political machine to grow in power, it required an increasing number of those in society who are marginalized and needed to be serviced. Thus, for instance, for every hardcore homeless drug addict that is welcomed into Washington State, an increasing allocation of tax revenues is required to service this person, and with that, the growth and reason for the existence of that political machine. To give you a sense of the magnitude of this, it is estimated at Perplexity AI that there are over 16,800 people who are homeless on any given night in King County. And the funding from all sources, private, public, and everything related, is estimated to be over 100,000 per homeless person. That's per year. That's how much is needed an outlay to deal with the problem. I mean, that's a lot. And a large part of those services are for chronically homeless drug addicts. And part of this funding, and this is very important, is helping expand drug use and crime in the neighborhoods. Why? Because you put these homeless in these low barrier, and I'll get to the low barrier thing later. You put these homeless in certain places, and they need to go out and buy drugs because they're not getting treatment first. So I'll get to that later. Okay. So in this context, there were 5 major developments. Go ahead.
Yeah.
That up. There are 5
Okay.
major developments of strategic importance that occurred.
Oh, wrong one. Oops.
There are 5 major strategic developments that occurred between 2012 and 2020 that have led to the current dystopian conditions in King County and other places in Washington State. The first is the 2012 initiative passed to legalize marijuana, in which Washington State became the first state to actually legalize marijuana. And with this and subsequent developments, the stage was set for an increasing permissive attitude in the population toward drug use and drug addiction. The second development takes off around 2013 when the Obama-Biden administration began promoting housing vouchers, permanent housing vouchers, stripped of funding or requirement for treatment in the case of drug addicts. In other words, they were giving these vouchers to drug addicts. It was this that started the whole campaign and narrative that you have to house them first before you can treat them. And this is a disaster. A lot of this stuff gets trashed. A lot of these housing gets trashed. People are on drugs. They're trashing it. And this whole housing first thing became the big, and there's reasons for why is promoted. But this became a crucial factor in the future warehousing of dying drug addicts and subsidized housing and shelters now dominating the streets and neighborhoods of Seattle and other communities. Okay, so the third one is the low barrier shelters and homes. So Seattle, along with San Francisco, were pioneers in this. Low barrier means that drug addicts could continue using drugs in state and private nonprofit subsidized domicile circumstances. One of the major nonprofits involved in Seattle, the Downtown Emergency Service Center, receives every year at this point $92 million, and its model is to put homeless people who are addicted into shelters. And the problem with that also is that they're putting people who are homeless who are not drugs into the same shelters. So they're at risk. Now this one is very important. This is a very important thing that happened in 2015. It was the beginning dissemination of a study by Gabe Mate of a work entitled In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. In Mate's study, early childhood trauma was posited as causing changes in brain chemistry and development leading to addictive behaviors in later adulthood. Now, in other words, the issue of drug addiction was transferred to a legal classification in Washington State as a disease. So now you can get treatment to maintain your drug addiction because of the stigma, and this not only removes the stigma of drug addiction, but also is lessening a drug addict's willful responsibility in being a drug addict. So now the fifth development, and here's where it really comes home. The fifth development became pronounced in the context of the 2020 BLM riots, and in Seattle, with the radical socialist misinterpretation of drug addiction as a disease caused by trauma to one where drug addiction was caused by the trauma created by racist injustice. So racist injustice is what creates the trauma that creates the drug addict. So in this sense, the drug addict is a victim of racism. That law enforcement efforts at dealing with the criminal problems related to enforcing drug laws are police brutality against minorities and the poor. This led to riots and demonstrations demanding the defunding of police departments, the decriminalization of all drugs, and shifting resources to nonprofits from police departments to run community behavior centers that replace law enforcement. So that's what happened following 2020. This also led to the popularity in the radical socialist milieu of labeling anyone a racist who calls for treatment first. It is the radical socialists who mainly gave drug addiction a social justice reason for existence. Treatment first proponents were routinely targeted, harassed, and labeled. The combination of all 5 of these developments taken together over roughly 8 years led to a situation where homeless drug addicts have more rights in their progression towards death than the rest of society. These views I'm talking about had become so pronounced that by 2020, at a King County City of Seattle event on Seattle's law enforcement assistance diversion, meaning that you get arrested for a crime and then you get diverted instead to some kind of facility for reform or for work or for whatever. Both the then Seattle attorney, Pete Holmes, the law enforcement prosecutor of Seattle proper, and the chief law enforcement officer and the King County prosecutor, Dan Satterberg, in their presentations at the event, and this was a shocking thing for me when I saw the video of it, made the point that everyone needed to accept and adjust to the reality that the war on drugs had been lost. So this LEAD program, which is a law enforcement assistance diversion, is also low barrier. Like, you're going to stop crime by accepting drug addicts into your your diversion program. The combination of all this has been to create a disaster of trash housing, trash neighborhoods and businesses, a large drain on the tax base, damage to the community, loss of businesses, rising insurance rates to cover the damage, and much more. So who profits from all of this? Well, there is the financial profit and the political power and control over Washington state of those involved in this Frank Chop political machine and the nonprofits involved. But that's not enough to explain why this is happening. There is a deeper spiritual and emotional issue among the vast number of decent people who want to appear to be compassionate and loving to others and themselves, and that regrettably want to help those who are addicted to drugs. Unfortunately, much like a mother who wants to do anything to help a son or daughter who is an addict. The tragedy in this is that that kind of support only enables that offspring to continue using drugs. Hardcore addicts only get off drugs under two primary circumstances. One, when the pain of being a drug addict becomes so great and death is staring them in the face. Or, upon following an extensive treatment program, a new life emerges sufficiently engaging that the addict prefers not to go back to drugs. Now, along with the intimidation and being labeled and targeted as a racist for proposing wanting treatment first. You don't go to the shelter, you get treated first. You go to prison or you get treated. One of the two. This misguided compassion of wanting to help drug addicts is being used to destroy our society. These two kind of work together. The fear of being labeled a racist manifests in many people the desire to appear compassionate. Without these two reinforcing influences, the obviousness of what should be done would take precedence over preserving the power of the Frank Chop political apparatus that dominates Washington state. The paradox is that in King County, there is a dearth of treatment centers. Drug addicts are not going to treatment centers, despite the rise in their numbers. Why? Because addicts rarely volunteer to go to treatment centers, especially when they are supported by a growing social services, narcotics enabling machine industry. The most recent development in this occurred last month, in June. An entity called the legislatively created in 2021 Substance Use Recovery Services Advisory Committee, SURSAC, came out recommending the creation of a state-paid buyers club for implementing safer supply program of hard drugs for addicts. More enabling, more expansion of the drug plate. Nothing in society is ultimately more disconnected from reality than a society which mistakes its greatest form of altruism and righteousness to the enabling of the growth of drug addiction and crime in its population. This dystopian dynamic of political power, nonprofit-run social services enabling the rise of the homeless addiction will destroy any society. We were once a civilized, relatively paradise of community, neighborhoods, and prosperity amid the most beautiful natural surroundings that beckon to the world. That was the Puget Sound. That was the Seattle area, which now instead mainly beckons to drug addicts across the nation looking for the best place to die taking their drugs. So it is time to organize an effective movement to end our dystopian circumstance. So let's go to the next slide. So these are just ideas that have surfaced. So there's proposed approaches, messaging, and initiatives. So what is required is a coalition needed of institutions, platforms, and individuals that can come to an agreement on singular messaging and specific initiatives. This is so that there is a unity and a concentration of effect. Now, you can attack this from many different angles, but the angle that I'm recommending people attack it is treatment first. Okay, treatment first. And stick to that. It doesn't matter what side of the spectrum, political spectrum you are, you go for you get enough of a mobilization for treatment first, and you can crack this machine. That's my view. Now, so these are some of the areas that might be used as messaging. Enabling of drug addiction is not compassion. A campaign on this would be considered and spread in the most possible way. Treatment first is not racist. The greatest cause of drug addiction is the easy availability of drugs, not childhood trauma. Drug addiction is not a disease. Any low barrier shelter or housing will lead to increased drug addicts. Drug addiction, crime, mental illness, trashing of neighborhoods, shoplifting. In other words, you got to put an end to the low barrier housing. You have to cut them off from the funds. All of the profits involved, all of the nonprofits involved in this have to get cut off from any funding for low barrier shelters. So those are some of the ideas. Now, the initiative targets are to increase law enforcement effectiveness, mandatory treatment first, ending funds for all low barrier shelters and housing, especially through nonprofits, establishing greater scrutiny of nonprofits who are, and because they have a tendency to be incestuously related to the people administrating the local governments. So I'll stop there and open it up for any discussion.
That was tremendous. Thank you so much.